This is an interview for the Industrial Relations Society of New South Wales Oral History Project. The interviewee is Marian Baird and I'm the interviewer, Judy Hughes. The date is the 30th of November 2021. Welcome, Marian. Can we start with your early influences in life, where you're from and a bit about your family?
Yeah, thanks, Judy. I grew up in Sydney, born and bred on the northern beaches of Sydney. And I had a father who was very, very industrially active, and he became a secretary of a trade union, and I think that was probably one of the major influences on my interest in industrial relations.
Sorry, what union was that?
Well, it was a small, it was actually quite a small union, a craft union, the Australian Institute of Marine and Power Engineers. So he was a marine engineer, he was away from home for long periods of time, and I grew up in a family with a migrant mother who didn't speak much English, so my role was really, I think, to sort of be the lead person at home. I had 5 much younger brothers and sisters as well.
What did you learn from your father about industrial relations in those early years?
Yeah. So it's very interesting. He, both observing and listening, the observations were that he was always heavily involved in disputes and negotiations, and of course that is through the 60s and 70s in Australia when industrial disputation was very high. The importance of solidarity and the importance of belonging to a union who represented your interests. He was also a person who believed strongly that you had a complaint, you had to get up and do something yourself. You can't just rely on the union or another organisation to do things. So you had to be active and engaged in whatever you did. His other core belief was that he was the male breadwinner, and as the male breadwinner, he should be able to have a job that was secure and paid enough to enable him to look after his family, his wife and family. My mother didn't have a paid job, and so we didn't live a very luxurious lifestyle by any means, but we had all the needs covered. But really, he really was driven by this belief in the need to have, as I said, a secure job and an appropriate level of wages to feed and house a family. And that really drove him. So it sort of was interesting because when I went to university, was the early 70s, and there were lots of disputes on campus as well as in workplaces. And he said to me, go to university and demonstrate. He really sort of instilled that, you should fight the system where there were things wrong. But I also took up feminist issues very strongly, and I think that was a little bit of a challenge for a long time because he saw the role of men as breadwinners and male breadwinners. But by the time I was fighting for by the time I was fighting for paid maternity leave, he was fully behind me and giving lots of advice on how to deal with the government and bosses.
What about your mother? Can you tell me a bit about her?
Yeah, I'd say Mum was the practical person in the family. She dedicated herself to cleanliness and housekeeping, and that's what she did. She was determined to make sure that the budget was kept every week and that we were clothed nicely and fed well, but she wasn't engaged in my schooling or university at all. So it was quite a stark division of labour and interests in the family. I suppose religion was the other big thing that played out in our household. Mum was Catholic and Dad was Protestant, and that caused huge arguments until he later became Catholic as well. So we sort of saw a change in his attitudes. When I say he became Catholic, he still fought on many issues, but he took on the sort of social justice side of Catholicism.
What sort of student were you? Can you tell me a bit about your school years and what your interests were?
I loved school. I loved everything about school. I loved going to school. I loved my exercise books. I loved learning and reading. And I was incredibly boring and conscientious, really. I spent all my weekends stamp collecting and reading. And that was me at school. It wasn't until university that I really branched out. So I was a very well-behaved and studious person at school. I was the first of my father's and mother's side of the family who went on to year 12 and went to university. And I think it was always expected that I would set a standard that others would then follow.
What did you study at university and where did you go?
Yeah. So I went to Sydney University and I studied, I enrolled in a Bachelor of Economics. I was on a teacher's college. This is sort of relevant to industrial relations because I got a teacher's college scholarship, or a New South Wales Department of Education scholarship. That paid for my undergraduate degree, but it also paid for a Diploma of Education, and I would then be bonded to the New South Wales Department of Education to be a high school teacher. So I studied economics, and over those 3 years I also studied industrial relations, and that was one of the subjects we could take, and I loved it. Kingsley Laffer, who was the founder of the Industrial Relations Society in New South Wales and of the Journal of Industrial Relations, was one of my lecturers. So industrial relations as a discipline was just coming into its own at Sydney University at the time. And I always feel incredibly fortunate that I was there in those early 70s to mid 70s where IR was, a massive topic. There were wage indexation debates, debates about industrial conflict, debates about the arbitration system versus the conciliation and mediation systems. So it really grabbed my interest and I loved studying that. But because I had a scholarship from the New South Wales Department of Education, I actually had to become a school teacher. So I went over to do my dip ed on the other side of campus. The Merriweather was the building we did economics and industrial relations in at Sydney University, and the old Teachers College is right on the other side of campus. But when I went over to begin my dip ed, we had to see a counsellor, and she said to me, "Why aren't you doing an honours in industrial relations?" Because my marks were so high. And I said, well, we don't teach industrial relations in schools in New South Wales, so I didn't think I was allowed to do that under the scholarship. And she was a fantastic woman. She said, well, I think you can. And she sent me back with another year of scholarship to do my honours in industrial relations. I still became a high school teacher, but about 5 years later I came back to university and did my, well, no, actually it was 15 years later. I came back and did a PhD in industrial relations.
What was Kingsley Laffer like as a lecturer?
Well, my memory of Kingsley was he was a very proper person and he was sort of old school academic, always wore a suit, and was a very had a particular style of lecturing. He knew his subject matter, of course, very well. And I do remember one of his phrases was about industrial relations is always about bargaining, internal and external. Bargaining inside the workplace and bargaining outside the workplace. So that was sort of a key feature of his classes. And apart from that, I just recall him as a very, as I said, sort of a gentleman style of lecturer. Old-fashioned in some ways, you might say today.
What attracted you to industrial relations?
As a subject? That's a good question because actually it didn't start until year 2 of the degree. It was a second year subject. And I think probably it was my training at home on unionisation and bargaining and conflict which I was very well aware of from my father, that made me interested in the topic. I also, throughout school, had always, and in my economics, I did economics at school as well, had always seen that a lot of what we were taught didn't actually make sense in terms of the real world of work, and that industrial relations was, to me, a much clearer explanation of why people had conflict with their bosses, why people needed higher wages, why people fought for better working conditions. And so those sorts of issues were, I think, inherent in my belief system, and I was interested to see what the academic theories and explanations for that were. It was also a period, you know, this was 1975 by this stage. It was a period of huge there were student movements, union movements, political movements, the feminist movement. There was a lot of activity going on. People were highly engaged in every issue, really, and that really attracted me. I loved it.
So what did you do your PhD on, and what happened to your career after that?
Yeah, well, that's interesting because I didn't do my PhD till many years later. As I said, I became a high school teacher, and as life happens, I went to Queensland because my husband had got a new job at a union as well in Queensland, and I'd been teaching in the secondary school system in New South Wales, and when you move interstate, you have to resign from your New South Wales Department of Education job in order to get a job in the other state's Department of Education. And we went to Queensland, and I had thought that I would work for the for the Queensland Department of Education. But I couldn't get a job immediately, and I applied for other jobs, and one of the jobs I got was with the Queensland Teachers Union, which, you know, was a nice sort of mix and meld of my education background, but also my interest in industrial relations. So I worked there for only about a year, or year and a half, and then we came back to New South Wales, and I had my first child. So this is about 1983 now. And after she was born, I was looking for work, and one of my old tutors from Sydney Uni, when I'd done my honours degree, was working at what was then called Nepean College of Advanced Education, and he asked if I was available to do some research work. As I didn't have any other work, and New South Wales had a surplus of social science teachers, which is what I was, it seemed a good option. So I started working at Nepean College of Advanced Education. We then went through the Dawkins tertiary education changes, and Nepean College of Advanced Education became part of the University of Western Sydney. So by this stage, I had a Bachelor of Economics with honours and a Diploma of Education, but I didn't have a PhD, and I was teaching in what was now a university. So it was clear to me that I really needed to either make a decision to go back into school teaching, or if I was going to stay in higher education, to do my PhD. And I really wanted to stay in, by this time I loved university teaching and research as well, so I began my PhD. That was 1994. So it took a while, and I had 4 children, so my youngest started kindergarten and I started my PhD. And my PhD was on high commitment work systems and union avoidance strategies. So it was a very 80s topic really, or I was doing it in the 90s, but you know, there was a whole influx of high performance, high commitment work systems through workplaces in Australia and America. I was studying a particular organisation who also had embarked on a high commitment work system, but in the US they'd done it quite differently to Australia, and I undertook a study of what that meant for the role of unions in the Australian system when you have this sort of imported American consultancy model into an Australian workplace. And it was on green... Pardon?
What did you find?
Well, what did I find? The other key element of that thesis was it was about greenfield sites. So when a company has an opportunity to set up a brand new factory or a brand new workplace, they have the opportunity to bring all these new techniques and processes in, which is what they did. Well, what I found was that, and I used a theory that had been developed in America by Koch and Katz and McKersey, who are very famous American scholars in industrial relations, that was about the way in which workplaces are transformed. And they had this theory that management had the upper hand. They decided what the strategic direction was going to be, and they determined whether they would work with a union or avoid a union. So they had a theory about working with unions or avoiding unions. Cut that bit. I'll start again. They had a theory that they would either work with unions in a positive fashion, and managers would cooperate with the union, or they would conflict with the unions and be very adversarial. And there were two paths that managerial strategy was taking. My argument was that actually when you started to look at these new forms of management, high commitment work systems, as they played out in greenfield sites, that management had a third option, and that was union avoidance altogether, that they would set up a new workplace with a new workforce who hadn't deliberately recruited, who hadn't been unionised before, and introduce new forms of consultation and involvement that meant the union was no longer necessary. So I added to that theory about greenfield sites being used as a union avoidance strategy. And I found they could do it, and they did it reasonably successfully, but it led to a host of other problems because the highly unionised workers, both the workforce and their sort of middle management foremen, had all the skills about how to operate the particular machinery. This was a manufacturing company. And by deliberately not employing those types of workers again, they recruited people who didn't have the skills and therefore couldn't run the machinery in the way that it needed to be run and couldn't maintain it. So for the first couple of years, it really couldn't be as profitable or as productive as it was intended to be. So that whole body of knowledge that's held within a workforce, especially if it's been a highly organised and unionised workforce, is lost if you don't bring them over to a new site. So that was one finding. A second finding was quite interesting. Because it was a high commitment system, they did work very closely with the workers on bringing them into, believing in the principles of the company. But they also had to employ a small casualised workforce at certain times of the year to do packing. But those workers also bought into the commitment system, and they wanted to become permanent employees in the same way. So that high commitment work system was so pervasive that it sort of worked against the company for a while, because their casualised workers became very dissatisfied because they weren't allowed to become permanent and be as committed and loyal as the company or the company's principles stated.
So after your PhD, what was your academic career after that?
Well, while I was doing my PhD, a job came up at the University of Sydney, where I had done my undergraduate studies, and I applied for that job as a lecturer in industrial relations. Russell Lansbury, who I think you've interviewed, was the head of the department. He had also been was my supervisor for my PhD. And I applied for that job, and I didn't get it. It was offered to a fully qualified person from the UK who was offered the position. She had the PhD, she had academic credentials and experience. But at the last minute, she decided not to come to Australia. And so I was offered the position. I was the second on the list, and I was offered the position. So I took the job. This was 1997. I hadn't actually completed my PhD by that stage. So I had to go to part-time PhD because I was working full-time as a lecturer. And that was a huge, the next 3 years were a massive work effort. I had 4 young children completing my PhD and working full-time as a lecturer at Sydney University. And, you know, we did everything in those days. Big classes, 400 students in our undergraduate industrial relations units. I was undergraduate, what we call undergraduate coordinator, so I was checking the curriculum was right, doing a lot of reviews of coursework, and of course writing my PhD and doing the rest of work that you have to do as an academic. But I had joined the Industrial Relations Society actually much earlier when I was working at the University of Western Sydney, or which was then PNCAE.
Tell me about your involvement with the society. What made you join?
Yeah. Well, I joined because I was not quite a practitioner, although I was always a union rep for lots of things. So I was quite involved on campuses as well. And eventually I was the academic vice president at the Sydney University branch of the NTEU, the National Tertiary Education Union. But of course I was teaching industrial relations, and I thought it was very important to keep abreast of the practical and applied changes that happened in the field. I think that's one of the unique things about our subject, that it's not just an academic discipline, it has real-world application, and we see it every day. So I joined to make sure I was in that network of people who were studying industrial relations. I also had colleagues from university. Anna Booth and I did our honours together. She had gone on to be a union secretary, and eventually she became a member of the Fair Work Commission. But I'd kept in contact with a lot of the honours students who were now working in industrial relations, and many of them were members of the society at the time as well. So, you know, it seemed the appropriate thing to do to join my professional association.
What was the society like in those days?
Well, I have to admit, given that I was still doing my PhD, I had 4 small children and I was working, I didn't participate in many of the activities. I would go to the occasional annual conferences and I enjoyed those, but I wasn't part of the day-to-day running of, I wasn't involved in the day-to-day activities. The clear observation, however, was that it was a society where men dominated. There were many more men as industrial relations practitioners, in the commission, managers, consultants, and very few women. So that both, it didn't surprise me because I had, all through university, most of our course, there was always a ratio of sort of 70% men to 30% women, but things were changing. So I think I was sort of interested in the gender composition of the profession and the activities that they were undertaking, but actually it was the issues I was more interested in at that time. My awareness of the way in which the whole industrial relations system was fashioned around men and for men, the male breadwinner, as my father was, really came to me after I finished my PhD, which may seem a bit of a surprise, but my PhD was in a very traditional IR field, and I know I felt I had to do that to prove that as a woman I could study and be effective in the sort of traditional realm of industrial relations. Once I'd done my PhD, I actually changed my research interests quite dramatically.
In terms of the society, when did you become more active and what were you looking to do then?
Yeah. So by the time I'm a fully fledged lecturer at the University of Sydney, and I finished my PhD. This is sort of the early 2000s now. I begin to be more active again in the society itself. And I can't pinpoint the exact date, but I worked closely. Of course, I had Russell Lansbury as my boss, and he was very active in the society. So I was very aware of the activities they were conducting and attending conferences. And then I became a co-editor of the Journal of Industrial Relations, which belongs to the National Society, but has for many, many years been housed in New South Wales. So in my role as editor, I did feel more responsible for having to attend many more meetings. So I sort of then began, I suppose, by about 2008, 2009, attending meetings of our New South Wales branch regularly and becoming quite involved at the branch level.
And because there was that male sort of culture, did women band together in the society to support each other?
No. That wasn't a feature of the society at all. I'm not saying we worked against each other, but that wasn't the focus of the society. You know, the focus was industrial relations. I'd say more recently there's been a little bit of that, but still it's really not, the groupings are not around gender. They're around your place in the class system of work, whether you're a manager, a union, or an academic, or a consultant, or a commissioner. So and those people don't all operate separately now. You know, we do work very, I think, productively together, but it's not around gender lines.
Did you hold any other leadership positions with the society?
Yes, so then in the New South Wales Society, it's understood that the president will come from one of the different groups on a sort of rotating basis. And I became president, as we had more than one academic representative on the committee, but I became president in about mid-2015 and stayed for 2 terms. Usually it's, maybe that is the practice. Anyway, you don't stay for much longer than 2 terms. So I was president from 2015 to 2017. And that was a really important time. And I took that role very seriously because, 1, because I was female, 2, because we were going through a period of really examining what did the Industrial Relations Society mean to people and what did it stand for. We needed to increase our membership. We needed to tidy up our finances. We needed to, I thought, get ahead of the game a bit and project ourselves in terms of being a network of people who had something to say about the future of work. You know, 2015 doesn't seem that long ago, but in fact, the future of work was being debated, but not within the society that much. So I remember it fell upon us in 2016 to coordinate the national conference, and I drove that conference, and our topic was work and the future, where are we now and what's next, and brought in different speakers to talk about what they could see happening around Australia, and really give a slightly different, sort of a new energy, I hoped, to what the society was thinking and doing. So I brought in Hugh Durant-White, who went on to become the chief scientist for a period of time, to talk about demographic change in cities and workplaces around Australia. That was a really fantastic discussion. The future of platform work and gig work, Uber, for example. So we really did try and capture a bit of the spirit of the debate that was happening at the time. The other big challenge to industrial relations everywhere I'm talking from university angle as well, as you know, by this time I had become a professor in my department and I'm now head of the department. The big threat to industrial relations teaching and the subject itself in Australian universities came from human resource management. And that also was reflected in workplaces where human resource managers and human resource management was really the flavour of the month and dwarfing industrial relations. So, you know, in terms of societies, we also had the Australian Human Resources Institute established and really flourishing. And so during my period as president, you know, I wanted to get some foundation blocks in place, make sure we had good finances, make sure that our membership could increase. And Jonathan Hamburger was terrific in starting to build that up and really turn around a bit the sort of interest, bring the unions back into the society. And I think we did do that. You know, the society is a group of people who are volunteering, and I give them great credit for the hours and hours that they do put into society, meetings and events and developing things. So that in that time when I was president, I really tried to focus on those three areas: membership, finances, and a new face for the society.
And by then, were there more women entering the field?
Definitely. I'd still say it was male dominated, but in universities, for example, we had many more students doing our degree, many more female students. Many of those actually go into human resource management, however, not into industrial relations. But I've seen a bit of a switch in the last 5 years, and I think industrial relations is a much sexier topic again. Issues of wage theft, casualisation, insecurity at work, the gender pay gap, all those issues that now really, you know, are in the press all the time are matters of industrial relations, and we're seeing many more women be attracted to the field and work incredibly well in it. We have, at Sydney University, we have a capstone unit which focuses on actually giving the students an enterprise bargaining scenario that unfolds in real life, and we do it with the Commission here in Sydney. And of that class, 90% are now women. But I'm really proud to say that they're incredibly well trained, not just in the theory, but in the practices of industrial relations.
That's great. We're just about out of time, so is there anything that you wanted to speak about that we haven't covered already?
I think there's a few things. I'm assuming you may have covered some of those, Judy, with people like Russell. I think it's very, very important to remember that the New South Wales Society is part of the Australian National, the Employment ALERA, the Australian Labour and Employment Relations Association. We have a different naming now. But also that we're members of an international network, and that network holds conferences, and Sydney hosted one, and we will host another one. Whether it's Sydney or another city, I think is still yet to be determined. So I think it's really important to, you know, realise that we are perhaps a relatively small society in one sense, but we're connected nationally and internationally. And because Australia's always had such a unique industrial relations system, we do find other countries, especially in academia, interested in what we're doing. And from an academic point of view, in our university, we have wonderful connections with universities around the world, especially in the UK, not surprisingly, and the USA. And those people are also members of their respective associations in their countries. So, you know, I think it's a wonderful network to belong to. And for me, industrial relations will always be of enormous fascination and interest. And, you know, it's a subject that really we should be teaching in high schools, I think, as well. And the society is playing a great role in that. There's a couple of things the society could look at in the future. The female membership thing, I think, on its own is not an issue, but perhaps networks for women and mentoring for women in that the issue is not when they enter the field, it's getting progression in the field that's probably the barrier now. But we have a lot of leading female lawyers and practitioners now too in industrial relations. And, you know, heads of our union movement and our business councils, many of them are women as well. So we've seen a huge turnaround from the 70s to when I joined to now.
That's great.
Thank you.
Thanks very much for your time.
Thanks, Judy. I hope that worked out.